Of most important that I would recommend that you read is the text of the Holy Father's homily during the Beatification Mass. And he stresses the historical significance of he talks about the first time I ever heard of this term, the ecumenism of the martyrs. He points out that people were martyred by the communist system, by the Nazi system, of all religious faiths, and simply for being religious and believing in God and believing that God has a purpose for society on earth. So it's a very moving homily. There's reprints of several articles, one from the Delaware County Times, the Catholic Standard Times, the Wanderer, the Linacre Quarterly. That reprint has some references to books that I'll mention at the end, so you can have those. And also from the Ukrainian Weekly, the biographies there, which are a little more extensive than what Rome put out. And if you read about all these martyrs, I'm just going to talk about my grandfather. It would take hours, but there were 28 beatified. And to get an idea of what went on in those days. I mean, this was well before I was born. I was born in 1945. We were already refugees. My grandfather was martyred by the communists in 1941. I had never personally met him, but today, after all this study and after this, I kind of feel a special relationship, I think, as all of us do in the family. And I'm going to show you a 10-minute videotape from the Beatification Mass. That's lasted 3.5 hours. My wife Pat will remember it very well. She stood ankle-deep in mud after a whole night of rain. But anyhow, we thought that was a good treatment for arthritis, right? You can't see the mud on the videotape. Looks wonderful. Anyhow, there were 1.5 million people. What I'd like to just point out, I'm not going to make any comments during the videotape. It is a splicing together of the official coverage by EWTN. And I'm going to be a little embarrassed in front of my good friend Tony here, who, if I listened to the way he told me to splice tapes together, it would have come out much better. But anyhow, it is a very amateur attempt, so you'll see some glitches and skips in there and so forth. But what I'd like you to look for is a couple things. In the introduction, where Father Peter Galadza, who is the commentator from the Ukrainian Church, he says a number of things that are historical significance about the Catholic Church, so that will give us some background. Later on in the videotape, just some minutes of listening to the liturgy, and Cardinal Huzar starting out the liturgy where he blesses, this is not the pontifical, but the bishop's liturgy. They start out with blessing the four corners of the earth. It's a very ornate and very long liturgy, and it goes back to deep roots way back to early Christianity. So get an idea of the flavor of the singing and the liturgy. And then we have excerpts from the beatification itself. Now keep in mind, 28 were beatified. Out of those 28, actually 27 were martyrs. They were beatified in 4 groups. Actually, 3 were individual, and then 25 were as a group. The individuals, one of the first that are mentioned is, or I forget the exact order, but there's Sister Hordashevska, who is a nun. She was not a martyr. She died at the beginning of the century, but she had founded a religious order that had done tremendous amount of social good and spiritual good for the country in difficult times. And so she was beatified. There's Father Emilian Koch, who maybe if we have time or maybe during questions and answer, I'll mention something about him. He's written up in your packet, who was martyred by the Nazis, his chief crime being to protect the Jews. There's Bishop Romja, who was from Ruthenia, which is a southern portion of Western Ukraine. And some of these terms get to be confusing. People, Russia, Ukraine, Ruthenia, White Russia, and so forth. So anyhow, and he was 35 years old as the bishop at the time that he was martyred. And he was such a strong opposer of communism that they finally just had to outright kill him. Even though they were trying to, do other things to disqualify him, but so he's another one. So he was beatified separately, and then you have the 25, which include my grandfather, Blessed Nicholas Konrad, priest, and number of bishops there. Charnetsky. They only mention Charnetsky and his companions. I always was confused by that terminology in the church. You know, you had the North American martyrs, and you had Isajiw and his companions. I always thought that these were people who just all died together. Nothing could be further from the truth. These are people who died under certain similar circumstances. My grandfather was one of the first 12 priests killed in 1941. Most of the others were killed at 45 or later on. So their stories are not all connected. Some of them didn't know each other. But they're all beatified as a group because the common thing was that they defended the faith in the face of communism, which was eliminating the church. So that's important to understand the way it's done. And there's the excerpt of the Pope actually pronouncing the beatification, and which was very moving to me because we were standing in that crowd, as you'll see, and watching him from still a distance, even though because it was well removed. The podium from security was tremendous during those times, and yet it was before 9/11, of course. But he says we, doesn't say I, he says we, with the authority granted to us by the apostles, pronounce these individuals blessed now and forever. And it occurred to me, I mean, there's anybody else in the world that has the authority to pronounce something forever. I can't think of another person. And it sticks. So and then immediately after that, we jump to the very end of the Mass. And what I wanted you to notice there at the end is the people raise the chant, which they've done over and over again, which is equivalent to what we see everywhere in the world. Says, John Paul II, we love you. And so there's a little bit of that. And then you see the scene of his final blessing, and you see him standing in the very last scene with that crucifix that he has, bent over. He's a shepherd, and in the background, 1.5 million people in the flock. And it's just a tremendous picture, I think, that'll go down historically. Keep in mind that the Holy Father did not actually celebrate the Mass. He sat in the throne in the back of the altar, because he celebrates Mass in the Latin Rite, and of course this was in the Byzantine Rite. Bishop Huzar, who's Cardinal Huzar, the Bishop of Lviv, celebrates the Mass. So I won't make any comments during the video. We'll see if we can go ahead with it. All right. This is TV, right? Is this thing on? Yeah, I'm pushing it now. Is the power not on? All right, there we go.
Continuing coverage of the papal visit to Ukraine. This is John Paul II's final day in the Slavic nation. I'm Raymond Arroyo, joined on set by Father Peter Galanza, a Ukrainian Catholic priest and a liturgy professor at the Shapinsky Institute in Ottawa, Canada. In a moment, we'll be bringing you live coverage of a divine liturgy presided over by the Pope from Lviv. During the liturgy, the Pope will beatify 28 Greek Catholics. For those of you who may be new to our coverage, these are Eastern Catholics in full union with Rome who lost their lives for the faith. It's true.
So he's there along with a significant government delegation.
And an enormous crowd having turned out today. A sunny day, a beautiful day. It's probably the brightest of the entire visit. John Paul II now being vested by Bishop Marini there on the left side of your screen, the ever-vigilant master of ceremonies, always at the Pope's side. Particularly during the liturgies and any liturgical events of congregation.
But what is important to keep in mind is that the Ukrainian Catholic Church is the largest of all of the Eastern Catholic churches in the world. Those Eastern Catholic churches are the Coptic Catholics, the Armenian Catholics, the Melkites, Maronites, etc. But the Ukrainian Catholic Church has 6 million believers worldwide, which makes it the largest Eastern Catholic Church.
Father, today, of course, the focus of this liturgy will be the commemoration of these 28 martyrs to the faith. Let's talk about some of them as we see the people, and they're waving. It appears they have pictures of some of these martyrs that they're waving in their hands.
Yeah, some of these martyrs have been known to the public at large for quite some time. People like Konrad, the brother of Metropolitan Bishop Titsky, Bishop Nikolai Chernetsky, who is actually buried in Lviv at the famous Lechaki cemetery. There are various reports of miracles that he's buried. On the other hand, there are, I would say, at least half of the blessed are these pictures I've never seen before. I was very grateful for the copy of the secretary reminder that I received from you today, which provides pictures of all of these.
And in its entirety, this is EWTNU's live coverage of John Paul II in Lviv, and the start of this morning's Divine Liturgy in the Byzantine Rite.
That's one of those glitches. It's fine, it's okay.
John Paul II in Ukraine. So petitions with which every divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, in fact, almost every divine liturgy of Basil the Great begins. And the response time and time again is Lord, have mercy. The 1930s. And as we said earlier, this bishop was really marked for death. Of course, very important to the Ruthenians listening in, those watching around the world, and certainly here in North America.
Yeah, the Ruthenian Byzantine Catholics have an outstanding patron in the person of Bishop Theodore Bonjour, profound faith, great intellect, pastoral zeal.
And as Father was saying earlier, in 1947, a military vehicle ran into the bishop's horse and carriage, but it did not kill him. When the soldiers found he wasn't dead, they beat him severely into unconsciousness, imagining they had killed him. But still, he survived, and it was later in hospital where he was poisoned by a visiting nurse.
And that testimony of the nurse came to light several years ago once the KGB archives were opened. The nurse came to light several years ago once the KGB archives were opened. Moving to Father Madame Koch, the victim of Nazism, married priest, father of 6 children. Most of the diocesan priests who are going to be beatified today are in fact married, as our listeners of course realize that the Ukrainian Catholic Church has in practice adoption celibacy. In fact, in Ukraine, about 90% of the diocesan clergy are married. Father Madame Koch was murdered by the Nazis for sheltering Jews. Of beatification was ended in response to the presentations made by the bishops that we just heard. In other words, I'm sure he's about to say that in response to these requests and the requests of many others, he is proclaiming these individuals to be blessed. Raised by his apostolic authority, he permits that henceforth these servants of God, Elijah these are henceforth to be considered blessed, and that their feasts are to be celebrated every year.
As the rain begins to fall in this congregational review, we hear a chant familiar in these past 5 days. John Paul II now closing this divine liturgy with a final blessing.
We have the final blessing. Display of the Catholic Church with both belongs, East and West. And that concludes our coverage. We invite you to join.
I think just perhaps a little flavor of what we experienced at that Mass. I have two other things with me. One, of course, the obvious portrait of my grandfather, Blessed Nicholas Konrad, which was recently painted in Lviv by a Jewish artist who does a lot of work for the Catholic Church in Lviv. And this tremendously, we visited with him when we were there, has this little cellar studio, kind of doesn't look like much, and he puts out these great portraits with, in the tradition of the icons. And he sort of modernizes them a little bit. And as you see with the halo around and the crucifix in the background, and you see the students on the left, because most of his life, Father Konrad was a professor, and of course, you know, the chalice and so forth. So here's a Jewish artist who grew up under communism until 1991, was a native of Lviv, experienced all the same things everyone else under communism, and you know, just a tremendous man. Anyhow, what you see there in the hanging is not my coat, but I'll come back to that at the end when we talk about relics. That's actually the cassock that my grandfather was wearing when he was shot on June 26, 1941. I'm going to briefly go through a little biography, and as I go through it, maybe start making some of the connections, the theme about heroic virtue and so forth. Father Konrad was born on May 16, 1876, in a small town near the big city of Lviv. Just again to reiterate, Lviv is the capital of Western Ukraine. To the east is Eastern Ukraine, which at the time that we're talking about had already been under communism since 1921, you know, through 1939. To the west is Poland, and further west is Germany. And then, of course, in there is Hungary and so forth if you want to go in different directions. But to the north, of course, is the big giant Russia, which has colored Ukrainian history throughout ages. At age 13, young Nicholas Konrad finishes what is called secondary school, which is actually sort of 8th or 9th grade. He's found to be very brilliant, and through a grant of these, they call the priests of the resurrection, I think it's the same order as the Salesian fathers, he is then sponsored as a boy of 14 to go to Rome and study there. Studies a number of places in Rome, I won't go through them, but he is there between the years of 1889 to 1899. So it's from 14 to the age of 23. Now, and during that time, he picks up a PhD in philosophy and the degree of sacred theology, and is ordained in 1899 at the age of 23. Now, you know, they didn't kid around in those days. People, if you're going to make it, you did it early in life. You didn't have all this time to find yourself as we do in this country. So anyhow, and keep in mind, before he was ordained, he had to get married, because in the Eastern tradition, married priests have to be married and then ordained. Once you're ordained, you cannot get married. If you're widowed, you cannot get married again. So just as an aside, I remember my grandmother, who lived with us until I was age of 10. I don't remember everything about her. I was small. I wish I remembered more, but she would tell us the story of how what would happen when a few months before the ordinations of the seminarians, whether they were Rome or Lviv, it would suddenly dawn on them, you know, I better find a wife, or I'm going to remain a celibate priest. And of course, the families of who had daughters who, you know, were inclined that way would then have, you know, receptions and parties and invite these young seminarians to their homes in the hope of you know, getting them acquainted. So, you know, little did she know that, you know, that the life in the future would present these tremendous martyrdom, which, you know, was physical for him, but was also tremendous suffering for her. Anyhow, so I don't know exact date when he got married, but somewhere before 1899, probably just a few months before, because they would get ready and that would be part of this procedure. In the year 1900, keep in mind, his superior bishop, Bishop Andrew Sheptytsky, who you hear a lot about in the literature and so forth, who was the bishop of Lviv and the entire Western Ukrainian Catholic Church up until the church was liquidated in 1945 forcefully. Became Bishop of Lviv in 1900 at age 35. So again, a young man. Bishop Szeptycki came from a very rich family. Most of it was Polish. He took all his inheritance and all his tremendous wealth and put it into the Catholic Church, into institutions, into good works, into social work, schools, hospitals, etc. He was not liked by the Polish because they considered him a traitor, because most of his family were Latin Rite Catholics, and he stayed with the Ukrainian Rite tradition. It's interesting that that is one reason that he is not yet beatified, although his cause was the first, started in 1948. He did not die as a martyr. He died a natural death, although suspected that he was also poisoned, but it could never be proven in 1945. And there were objections by the Polish bishops to his beatification throughout the years for various reasons, not all which have been removed, and we expect he soon will be beatified. Whereas the martyrs, who were, because there is a miracle that has now been, is in the process of being approved for Andrew Szeptycki. The martyrs did not need a miracle for the first step of beatification. They do need a miracle now, of course, to be canonized. So back to Father Konrad. He then, as a young priest, becomes a teacher in gymnasia, various gymnasia. These are what is called higher school, high schools. But they start from, age 14 or 15, right on through what would be equivalent to 2 years of college. And when you're finished that, you're 20 years old and you're finished with your education, and you do whatever you do. So he was not assigned to a parish. He worked in parishes, but his main job was teaching. Of course, somewhere in that time, he also got himself a degree in sociology. So he had 3 PhDs, sacred law, theology, philosophy, and sociology. During the First World War, he was assigned to minister to refugees in Hungary, and he also became the administrator of the school system there that was made for the refugees and the displaced person. Between 1920 and 1929, he returns to teaching in gymnasia in Berezhany and Ternopil. Ternopil is, of course, where my mother grew up at that time. Of course, he had 4 children. Not the oldest, but one of whom, my uncle Vladimir, is still alive. He's 92 years old in Innsbruck, Austria. Good air there in Innsbruck, they say. Now, in 1929, he was asked by Metropolitan Szeptycki to teach sociology in the newly formed Lviv Theologic Academy, where he subsequently also becomes professor of philosophy and eventually the dean of the philosophy faculty. It is interesting to point out that Metropolitan Szeptycki created the Theological Academy as the official center of all university religious education. And its students were not only seminarians, but all college students of Catholic universities in Lviv. As a matter of fact, that's where my father met my mother, at that place. So anyhow, as an aside, it's of great interest that in light of today's problems that we have in the Catholic Church here, not only the ones Dr. Haas mentioned, but the dissent and the heresy and the whole issue that's brought about this ex corde ecclesiae about teaching the truth in Catholic schools and universities. The brightness of Archbishop, we call them metropolitans, Szeptycki, he said, we're not going to have this. We're going to have one place where all religion is taught for all the students, university students in the Catholic system in Lviv and in the surrounding areas. And he appointed the professors to make sure that they were true to the magisterium of the church. So maybe there's a lesson to be learned about that. If we study history more closely, we will find that the social trends in Western Ukraine in the years 1929 to 1939, just as in the rest of Western Europe and in the United States following the 1929 stock market crash and so forth, I don't know what we termed that time in history, but they were similar with the spread of extremely liberal ideas, anti-religious secularism. There was the first sexual revolution, or maybe it wasn't the first, but it was a form of sexual revolution. If you remember, Margaret Sanger was popular at that time. You had the Protestant conference at Lambeth in England that for the first time broke with the tradition of the Catholic Church in terms of forbidding contraception. And much like the 60s and 70s of our own experience. Needless to say, just as we experience in the Catholic Church today, these forces were creating dissent within the Church, especially in the university, as is always the case. And Metropolitan Andrew Sheptytsky had a prophetic vision in this respect, creating a centralized institution for the teaching of theology, philosophy, and other related subjects. For the same reasons, in 1929, the bishop appointed Father Nicholas Konrad, by now a distinguished professor and chaplain and trusted defender of the magisterium of the Church, as the founder of the first student organization called Obnova, the Renewal, whose goal was to provide not only the teaching, to supplement the teaching with a social and cultural environment for young university students, which would enable them to resist the negative cultural trends of the time. It appears to me that this concept is much the same as the purpose of the Institute of Catholic Culture that we have here to provide that kind of thing. In the meantime, Father Nicholas Konrad and my grandmother, Antonina, parents of 4 children, of whom only my Uncle Konrad is still alive, a retired physician, were raising their own family. Of interest is everybody in the family became teachers, professors, college professors, secondary school professors. Just my uncle became a doctor and I became a doctor, but everybody else teaches, so we're the black sheep. Father Konrad's vocation was primarily that of a teacher and academician, excelling in both and culminating in the publication of a textbook, which is called The History of Ancient Philosophy, which was first published in 1935 and was later republished and re-edited in 1973 by our own my father, Peter Isajiw, who was a historian and who was a Ukrainian language expert, and he helped the people in Rome do this. And this was the last thing he did before he died, my father, in 1973. So this is a tremendous tribute to him also. This textbook was not only was not the abstruse history of ancient philosophy, but actually, if you can read it in Ukrainian, refers to a lot of how the ancient philosophy, the theme is there's nothing new in all the trends that have been going on in Western Europe at that particular time, as are going on today. And how the ancient philosophers handle them and the various heresies and the various ways of thinking about human existence. So today, there has been, in 1991, of course, the Ukrainian church became free again and communism left. And I think recently, in the last few years, the Theological Academy has been revitalized. As a matter of fact, was blessed by the cornerstone, was blessed by the Pope of the new building when he visited. And of course, this is being used as a textbook again in the new, so it has survived the test of time. So one might think that having achieved such academic stature and success by the late 1930s, and his children now all adults, married and pursuing successful careers of their own, and having achieved the age of 63, and good health in 1939. Of course, we did subsequently find out they did have diabetes, but apparently it was quite late onset and he had no physical disability. And so he was set for the rest of his life as professor and administrator at the highest level of academic excellence, represented by the Theological Academy of Lviv. However, divine providence had other plans for my grandfather and grandmother. Just as we recently witnessed an unforeseeable turn of events on 9/11, the sudden, unexpected outbreak of World War II in September of 1939 changed everything. Germany attacked Poland. Now, I remember my own father was in Lviv at that time, and what they saw was not very much. There was one German Stuka airplane came and dropped 3 bombs on the train station. In the early morning hours, and I think no one was killed because there was no one there. But that was the extent of what they saw. Of course, Poland was defeated very quickly. Ukraine, Western Ukraine, was part of Poland at that particular time. And Eastern Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So within, I think, several days, the German armies had defeated the Polish, although they fought valiantly, as we all know, but they still had cavalry on horses, and the Germans came with their super tanks, and we all know those stories. We've seen all those movies and so forth. So now everyone thought that there was a contingent of German army that came into Lviv took over, everybody thought now we're going to have a life under German occupation. But the anticipation of German occupation, however, was not the most unwelcome of these events, because people at that time yet, this is 1939, had no idea what to expect from the Nazis and how horrible they would be. And German culture was very predominant in Western Europe. German economy, German products. I know a fellow I worked for here as a student who made church furnishings. They said that their biggest thing in view at that time was to get machinery made in Germany. So that dominated Germany had already dominated the economic and the industrial part of Europe. So people were not that upset that the German occupation might come, especially when it was seen as a liberation from Poland, who had their own political aims of trying to destabilize Ukrainian society and prevent Ukrainian independence. But even there, the reality was completely different. Of course, later on we found out what the Germans were really like, but before this time, this small contingent of Germans who arrived in Lviv quickly relinquished their posts, and as a complete surprise, the Soviet army in full force rolled into town from the east. This was the effect of the secret treaty between Hitler and Stalin called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in which Germany occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, quote unquote, liberated Western Ukraine, reuniting it to Eastern Ukraine, which had already enjoyed Soviet, quote unquote, enjoyed Soviet occupation since 1921, resulting, as we all may know, in a ruthless totalitarian reign which had already produced the great artificial famine of 1932. Where 6 million Ukrainian farmers were forced to starve by the so-called collectivization of all private lands. Okay, and the Soviet occupation of Western Ukraine was dominated by what the Russian leaders of the Soviet Union were best known for: relentless propaganda, an entire social structure based on disinformation, manipulation, and exploitation of every political and social problem for one single end: the creation of a totalitarian state in control of all aspects of life, and the systematic and relentless elimination of anyone who might be opposed to this imposition of, in fact, slavery, of course, the first of whom was the Catholic Church. I want to refer you to an excellent book called The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, written by Robert Royal, just very recently published, actually commissioned by the Holy Father. I had the privilege to speak with Dr. Royal not too long ago, and he said, he had enough material for 2 of these books, but they had to be finished by October of the year 2000, because they had that big ceremony in the Colosseum in Rome where the Pope commemorated all the martyrs of the 20th century, and he insisted, as our Holy Father does, and he doesn't take no for an answer, the book has to be finished by then. So he said he had put together what he had. But anyhow, this covers the entire world and covers how there are more martyrs in the 20th century than ever before in the history of the world, in sheer numbers, and as we all know, of all the great isms, communisms, Nazism, etc., including Korea and so forth. But he covers a very good chapter on the persecution in Ukraine and so forth. And what I wanted just to quote here, he talks a lot about Metropolitan Sheptytsky. I'm going to skip that at the moment. But it talks about this first Soviet occupation, 1939. Soviets were careful at this early phase not to attack the church too overtly, or to apply Soviet laws that might have nationalized churches and forced registration of the clergy. In part, this was because they recognized the wide popularity and prestige of Sheptytsky. Confronting him directly might have caused a popular uprising. You had a unified nation. Most of the people, 95% of the people in that part of Western Ukraine were Catholics. They loved the church. There were these secular movements within the church and so forth as we have today, but they would not have tolerated the kind of persecution that actually did follow eventually. So they tried to go easy. And of course, the head of this whole entire operation in Ukraine was no one else but one Nikita Khrushchev, who, of course, we know later became Stalin's successor. And Khrushchev reported directly to Stalin as to what they were doing. Of course, the secret police was called the NKVD, later called the KGB. Interesting talk about different names for things and this. when I was a little confused when we first heard this little song that the people in the village where my grandfather was subsequently killed, they created a hymn in his honor, and they said that these people came to get him. There were the Czechistas, that means a ch, which is like a ch, a letter, and k. And I said, well, weren't they the KGB, NKVD, or whatever? And they were called members of the committee. CK means člen komitetu, members of the committee. So everybody knew what that meant when somebody was a member of the committee. You see, it was kind of a, harmless name. But so anyhow, but the teaching of religion was gradually banned over the next 2 years. The NKVD sporadically arrested priests it thought a threat. The regime struck harder, though, at crucial church activities. All religious periodicals were taken over and publications suspended. Books were removed from stores and libraries and destroyed. The seminaries were closed. The metropolitan's resources were seized and were those of the monasteries and convents, along with buildings and libraries. Religious congregations were dispersed, and because the church was regarded as socially unproductive, it had to pay exorbitant taxes, and so forth. So at this time, they were gathering all the names and who was who. So they said to people, oh, everybody go on, we're liberating Ukraine, we're not going to do anything bad, and so forth. It was a very, very smart way of get their roots in. Metropolitan Sheptytsky knew what was going to happen. He advised priests that if they wanted to, gave them permission to leave and go west to Poland and to Germany and wherever else they could go, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. A lot of the young priests who had wives and children and so forth took advantage of this and did leave. My parents, my mother and father, left. My father was an editor, by that time was an editor of a Catholic newspaper, he was teaching in a Catholic school. Of course, the schools were closed down. And just to give you an example of how things were, there was a deal that they had made with the Germans, the Russians had made with the Germans, that anybody of German extraction could leave that part of the Soviet Union, could leave Western Ukraine. Now, keep in mind, my grandfather and his family were not of German extraction. They had a name, Konrad, which had a completely different background. But my uncle, the doctor, who had studied some in Germany, had connections with people and intellectuals and so forth, was able to get paperwork, literally forged, that they had German blood in the family. So under the maiden name Konrad, my mother and my two brothers and my sister, I wasn't born until after the war was ended, were able to leave Ukraine at that time. Now, independently of my father went down to visit his father, who was also a priest in the more southern part of Ukraine, Ivano-Frankivsk, and he planned to escape illegally over the border because he couldn't use his name Isajiw and make it stick that he was of German descent. So, he was too well known. But to give you an example, when he finally did go over the border, a little bit, I think it was several months after my mother had left, he was stopped at the border and by a Russian. And keep in mind, all the people, the soldiers, the border guards, the government workers in Western Ukraine were all imported from Eastern Ukraine, or they were Russians. So they were either Ukrainians who were brought up for 20, 30 years under Soviet occupation and were full of the propaganda and the teachings that they had given them, or they were actually Russians who came from Moscow and other areas. So my father was stopped at the border, and this fellow said, well, you don't have papers, and he tried to say that he lived in this nearby town, that the border happened to be, right through the town, which it did, and so forth, and the fellow didn't believe him. He said, I think I'm going to have to send you to Siberia. And my father thought that was all over, and of course, had he gone to Siberia, I would have never come about. But he prayed the rosary. I mean, he told this was like one of the hardest times ever prayed in his life. And he said, but look, if you send me to Siberia, you will be sentencing an innocent man to, you'll be sending an innocent man. He said, that's okay. It is better to send to Siberia 1,000 innocent men than to allow one enemy of the people to escape. And of course, I say this as an example of what the reigning philosophy was. So it's just the reverse of the, what we expect today. Well, anyhow, he did get across the border miraculously. Actually, there were two miracles that my father always attributed. At that time, this was, couldn't attribute it to my grandfather. My grandfather was still alive. But he attributes to the Lord's intercession. He said, finally, this border guard said, well, I'll tell you, if you're telling me the truth, then these people in this town ought to know you. And he took him over to this house in the little town, and there was this elderly gentleman who was sitting on the porch, in his rocking chair, who, as far as my father knew, didn't even know what was going on or what. I doesn't know if he was senile or what, but he sat there, and the guy asked him if he knew my father. And the guy looked and looked and looked, and he said, oh, yeah, he lives right down the street down there. Never seen him before in his life. And the guy let him go, and he let him go, and that saved my father's life. And to the day that my father died, he could never figure out whether this elderly gentleman really understood what was going on and knew very well that this was an escapee and saved him purposely, or whether he was just senile and thought he knew him. He could never figure it out. Of course, never came back to ask. But that was that. Of course, there was a second time. I might as well say this now because it's an interesting. Again, I wouldn't have been born if this had happened. They had gotten to. It was later in the war, 1944. They had gotten to Czechoslovakia or somewhere in Slovakia. We're almost out of the grip of the Russian armies that were approaching now. Were defeating the Germans at that time, and all of a sudden, the town where the refugees were staying overnight. These Slovak guerrillas that were Russian-supported communist guerrillas came in and took over the town overnight. There was some shooting going on in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden by morning, you had these guys come in on horses with big machine guns and everything else, and we have now liberated this part of the country for communism. And the very next day they said, all able-bodied men will now be conscripted into the service to go with us up into the mountains and to fight the guerrilla war. And sure enough, my father, who was, for a year now, they've been escaping the communists, is now rounded up along with all the other able-bodied men, and is presented for a physical examination by a local doctor. And again, an elderly doctor, he said. And, this fellow was listening to everybody's heart. They were all standing in line. My father said he didn't know much medicine, but he knew that if he hyperventilated, he thought if he hyperventilated, he could get his heart to beat irregularly, and maybe he could flunk the test. So, sure enough, he flunked the test. Of course, the day my father died, he had serious illness, but he never had heart disease. He died at the age of 67. And again, whether this doctor was flunking everybody so often, every 10th guy or something on purpose, because he knew what was going on, or whether he really thought he had heart disease, I don't know. But my father was saved twice. But anyhow, back to the theme of this, in order not to save some time. So what happens, my grandfather at that point says, he could have left and done the same thing at these early days of the occupation. But he chose. He knew there was risk. And he asked my grandmother if she would go along with it. If she hadn't gone along with it, they would have left. Of course, they had to leave Lviv. The theological seminary, the theological institute was closed down. And they went to this little town 20 miles west of Lviv called Strach, which actually has a history, a church history, going back to the Tartars and the Turks and the Muslims in the 12th century, where there was caves where Christians hid when there was a Muslim invasion, and they were found there, and people were massacred. There was a great massacre in these caves in Strach. And Strach means a place where one suffers unto death. That's the kind of meaning of that name. And there's a church there which I'll have, after we're done, I'll have some pictures, I don't have any slides, but which was given by Pope Leo the 13th, I think, in the 19th century, the power of pilgrimages and so forth. So he became pastor there. So for the first time at the age of 63, or actually by that time it was 65, I think, yeah, he becomes pastor, a full pastor of church. And this goes for a year and a half. And all the time in the big city in Lviv, the Russians are more and more, anchoring their things. And they didn't bother too much in the little towns. They didn't have enough people. So he became a beloved pastor. We talked to some of the people who are now in their 70s, 80s, who were children then, and who said that not only were they received the greatest teaching in the faith, which lasted them through the entire years of communist occupations from 1945 on, but also remember my grandmother as being a teacher of the catechism, and she taught the children. So the wives of the priests, were not just, doing their own thing. They were very much part of the ministry of the faith. Thank you. So they're very kindly remembered. And this went on till June 22nd, 1941. And again, you might think, well, that was the beginning of the persecution of the church, and we all know later on something else happened, another unexpected event. On Sunday, June 22nd, which was in the Ukrainian rite the Feast of Corpus Christi, as the procession went 3 times around the church. Now, this is near the caves. Out further beyond the caves are woods. They go on for a long period of time. There's not a populated area. Happened to be an area where the Russian army had some kind of a base or some kind of something in that woods. I'm not clear exactly what, but they had soldiers stationed in those woods, or at least some kind of unit. All of a sudden, during the Mass, during the procession, German airplanes, again, Stuka's now a little bit different than the one plane in 1939, severe show of air power, come and start bombing the woods in the area. Not the town, but the nearby woods, and shrapnel and stray bullets start hitting the church, actually, in various places. And Father Konrad, said to his flock there, said, maybe we should finish the procession inside the church, just for everybody's safety, because of these stray bullets flying around. And he says, but we will not stop. We will finish the service. He says, be not afraid, which is, of course, what the Holy Father says today. He said, this is just, another event and unexpected event in the history of our country. And so they did. And we know exactly what happened because there was a young boy there, was 14 years old then, who is now a priest who witnessed all these events. As a matter of fact, he was one of the chief witnesses for the commission on the beatification. And he happened to be the son of the fellow in the village who did funerals. He wasn't really an undertaker, but it was sort of a jack of all trades. He actually did stuff with horses and so forth, but he was also the undertaker. And as his son, he learned a lot of things. He helped his father out and so forth. And he remembers all these things. So this was the beginning of the war against the Russians. The Germans secretly, without warning, on June 22nd, moved their tanks and the whole entire army against the Russians. 60 miles away is where the beginning of that front was. So now we had the next 4 days of retreating Russian armies. The town was located on 2 sides of a main road. The road was in a valley. The town is on a hill. And for the next 3 days, the 23rd, the 24th, and the 25th, you had nothing but Russian military vehicles retreating from the front. As you all know, the German offensive with the Panzers and the Blitz, what they call the Blitzkrieg, and so forth, was pretty effective. They had a list of a certain number of priests that were on their list as the more dangerous ones, because even during that time, he would always go to Lviv. He would be an advisor to the bishop. He was part of that group of priests that the bishop trusted the most. And the order went out that these priests should be just rounded out and arrested. And as it turned out, because of the fact that they were retreating so fast, instead of being arrested, they simply got shot. Although I don't know if the people doing the arresting knew exactly what was going to happen. At that point, they were rounding up a lot of political prisoners who were in jail in Lviv, various other bigger cities. There were estimated 17,000 prisoners, which were both Ukrainians, Polish. There were even some Jews who were opposed to communism, who were imprisoned in these places. And during those days, when the Russians were retreating, they went into the prisons and they shot every prisoner. They killed every prisoner. They left no one behind as they were retreating. And the KGB was given orders to kill priests. And during that period of time, 12 priests were killed, and my grandfather was one of the first. And the story was that he did his daily mass at 9 o'clock in the morning. This was Thursday, the 26th, and 22nd was Sunday, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th was Thursday morning. And that morning, my grandmother used to say and others, something was different. They didn't hear the noise of the Russian vehicles coming on that road. They had already gone, all the motorized people. There were only stragglers and people walking down that road. And my grandfather said his mass, and he said to the congregation, well, the Germans will be here any moment. And there was sort of an air of expectation, air of fear, so forth. And after the Mass, a sick call came in, and a lady who was sick was across the road on the other side, on part of the village. And my grandfather got ready to go with the sacraments to make the sick call. Well, the cantor, other people in the church said, "Father, please, don't go." They had already heard that other priests were killed on the previous day. This Father Coach, I may get back to him later, but an attempt was made on his life, but he wasn't killed a couple of days before in a different town. So they knew priests were being hunted down by the KGB. They said, well, let us just hide you somewhere for another 24 hours or so forth, because the Germans will be here and you'll be safe. And this is, his famous day says, but what if this patient dies without the sacraments? And he says, no, I'm going to go. But he said to the cantor, you stay. You got a wife, you got 2 children. I can go to the sacraments by myself. No sense you taking any risks. Cantor insisted. If you go, I'm going with you. And he did. So they had gone, made the sick call. They were on their way back, very close to their home. 2 of these members of the committee, one of them who was actually lived in that town, and everybody knew who he was. And there was another one who was from a nearby town, came up the hill on horses, because these little streets in that town, you couldn't drive cars in them, and grabbed him and the cantor, and at gunpoint led them away. They first led him to the home of one of those members of the committee, Chekista, and I guess phone calls were made or whatever, and soon after that, more KGB officers or KGB agents arrived in a car, in a motorized car. And what the townspeople know is that they saw that they were put in the car and driven away. And everybody assumed that they were going to be driven away to Lviv, where the prisons were and where other people were already in prisons. Well, as soon as they turned about a mile away, that you could no longer see the road from the town, they turned into the woods, those same woods, went in about, maybe 25 yards, and literally just took them out and shot both of them, just point blank. Now, it turned out later that there was a man who was working on the road who actually saw the car go in there, heard the shots, and heard some screams. Of course, he didn't admit to this until weeks later. So after this happened, nobody knew that it had happened. So the days went by, the next few days went by, the German armies arrived on the 27th, the next day. People went to Lviv to look at those bodies in the prisons, thinking that maybe they would be there, that they had taken there, and they knew that everybody was killed and those things, and they couldn't be found. Well, it was a week before the German commander would allow people to go into those woods, and he had no other reason except the fact that there were still live rounds of ammunition there were mines and so forth, to go to look into the woods, because I guess by that time this fellow had told his story, and sure enough they found their bodies. Now, my grandfather's body was actually found partially buried in the foxhole, which seemed to be a little bit away from where he was killed, like a few yards away. The cantor's body was found about 50 yards away. Now, what was obvious is the cantor tried to run, and he was very badly beaten. He was shot several times, and I guess that's where the fellow had heard the screams. His body was badly decomposed. It was at least a week later, if not, some people say it was 2 weeks later. It depends on what stories you hear, but it was at least a week later. My grandfather's body was not decomposed. As a matter of fact, it looked fresh. It looked very fresh. Part of it, we thought, or people said, was because it was partially covered by dirt. How did it get covered by dirt? Well, here it turned out later, 2 women who, again, witnessed that the day after the Germans arrived, or the very day the Germans arrived, they were on the street, and these 2 German officers, 2 German army men, were walking by or driving by or something, and they motioned to the women, and they pointed to the woods, and they started going like this and pointing to the woods. And the women were so scared they just ran away. They never understood what they meant. Well, here apparently the German soldiers had found his body in the woods, and had, at least half the German soldiers were Catholics, and he was obviously a priest at the time. He was in his priestly garb, and so they must have, buried him a little bit as they went by through that area, looking for stragglers. So anyhow, the bodies were brought back. It was there was a big funeral. It was a big ceremony. And this Father Borovich remembers at age 14 helping his father prepare the bodies. And they said, well, his father said, we won't let my grandmother see his body. He had a bullet hole through his chest, and he had a big cut on his forehead, like from a butt of a gun or something like that. And, but as they laid out the body, what looked like fresh blood was poured from the wound. The wound was through and through, the front and the back. And, you know, whereas the cantor's body was so decomposed, they could just wrap it up in a sheet and was smelling and so forth, and put him in a closed casket. Well, my grandfather, they were able to lay him out, put in all his vestments on, they had a big funeral and so forth. And about 4 or 5 days after the funeral, and as you know, we often wonder, well, the good Lord allows this to happen, he must have a purpose, as we know, purpose turned out. But what about the family? What about my poor grandmother, who was now, you know, in great distress, not knowing what had happened, feeling that maybe the reason, she didn't know this yet, but, you know, some people felt maybe the reason his blood looked fresh was he was alive for that week, just lying there wounded or so forth. Well, as it turned out, that was impossible because it was shot right through the heart. But she came to the undertaker about 4 days later, and she said, tell me, I want you to tell me, you know, how my husband died, because I can't sleep, I can't, you know, did he suffer, you know, what happened, how did they kill him? And he said, well, we were hoping to, you know, spare you that information, but I guess you have a right to it. And he says, but why are you coming now to tell me? Before I tell me why are, you know, you're coming this for that. She said, well, last night I had a dream, and in my dream, I saw my husband, Father Nicholas, coming to me up the road in his full vestments. And I said, Lunechko, Lunechko, where are you? You haven't been, we've missed you for all these days, we don't know where you are, what happened to you? And he says, I'm fine, I'm perfectly fine, I'm in heaven. And I am, you know, don't worry about me. I am, you know, just go about and worry about yourself and, you know, take care of things. And she said, well, what do you mean you're fine? You know, you're dead or something like that. And he said, well, I was very fortunate, he said, this is in the dream. He said, when they shot me, the first bullet that went through my chest, I just felt a sharp pain, and then somebody hit me over the head, and I was unconscious, and I felt no more pain. So he said, so don't worry, I didn't suffer, which is very interesting. Now, this is what she's telling the undertaker before. Now, when the body was laid out, and there's pictures of it, there was no evidence where the wounds were. They had covered everything up. Even the wound on the head, you have the priestly hat, you know, the big top hat that they had wear. So there was no evidence, you know, that the body was even mutilated in any way. So this was a sign. I'm sure this was a sign. So the good Lord takes care of his people. You know, he allowed this martyrdom to happen. But my grandmother, from that point on, was very satisfied that this was the Lord's will, and she didn't suffer herself anymore. Well, anyhow, a year later, what happened is, since he was buried in a wooden casket, a year later, she finally got a metal casket. And at that point, my father, my uncle, who's the doctor, several other people came into town. Remember, this is now under German occupation. This is not, you know, this relative freedom. I mean, there were problems obviously there, but it's not the same thing. And so they exhumed the body to bury it in a metal casket, and my uncle, who's a doctor, you know, examines the body, and there's no smell, no signs of decomposition. It's just dried up a little bit, looks like leather, and absolutely looks fresh. And this is 11 months later. And this had all happened in the middle of summer, in June, with heat and so forth, all the things that cause decomposition. It was never embalmed, none of these issues, this was all studied. So you have a case for, you know, incorruptibility. However, if you read the books and you talk to people, you know, with the causes of saints, that has nothing to do with becoming a saint. I mean, there are incorruptible bodies of people who never became saints. So, but it is a very interesting fact that happens. Now, in the process of beatification, they are supposed to exhume the body and study it. And, you know, there's a very interesting book that says How Saints Are Made by a fellow named Bill Dodds. It's written in very good language, kind of easy language. And, of course, the main reason that that's required by the church is to make sure that the person is actually there, the body is actually there. But in modern times, it doesn't apply because you know, the witnesses are so good and everybody knows what happened. So at last I heard, you know, the Holy Father was coming in June. He said, I want to beatify some people. Give me a list of people to beatify. And his cause, which had been going on for several years, had not been complete yet. But the Holy Father gave a dispensation. He said, get all that stuff done later. Get the important stuff done so I can beatify him when I come to that mass in Ukraine. And that's what they did. So now they say that they're going to dispense with the exhumation, the latest word from people who we stay in contact with. They probably will not exhume the body, which was kind of a disappointment to me because I thought if they did, I would go there and witness it. But I guess that won't happen. Anyhow, let me conclude here very quickly and get to the end of this. Okay, I think I covered the historical and political reality of the times. I'm just going to give you to finish the historical end of it. 1945, of course, the Russian armies came back. The Germans were defeated. This is when the rest of the persecution began in earnest. The Catholic Church was completely eliminated. I'll just give you a little quote back from Dr. Royal here. He said, the raw figures alone are startling. From 1946 to 1949, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which started with 4 dioceses, 8 bishops, 2,772 parishes, 4,119 churches and chapels, 142 monasteries and convents, 2,000 diocesan priests, 164 monks, 773 nuns, 229 seminarians, and over 4 million lay people, was simply abolished, if sometimes to an underground existence waiting for better times. Many of the religious institutions were dispersed or, quote, liquidated. Bishops, priests, and lay people ended up in prison camps, dead from overwork or exiled. Not all of them were, of course, martyrs, but it is chilling to see official numbers indicating a flourishing religious community all simply reduced to zero. The Ukrainian Catholic Church under Soviets was the largest suppressed group of believers in the world. And what they did was they said, the only church recognized by the state is the Orthodox Church. That is the Ukrainian National Church. It was a church that they controlled. The KGB actually appointed the bishops to the church, and they said to all the priests, you either join the Orthodox Church or you're going off to Siberia. Now, Bishop Sheptytsky, who died in 1945, actually told the priests, you have to do this a matter of your own conscience. It's okay, to save your life, you can join. You have to make your own decision. But obviously some were joining with the intention of continuing to be Catholic priests and minister Catholic people. But they required some kind of a signature which stated that you renounced the Vatican as a agent of oppression, as a spy, all the standard communist things. So when even the priests who were willing to join were not willing to sign that statement. And they didn't sign that statement because those who did sign, then they later published these statements to the people saying, see, isn't it right that this is just Western corruption and so forth, so forth. So thousands went to their death in Siberia. Bishop Koma in Rome is now compiling, all these names and biographies of all these thousands of people, nuns, like who we heard about. And as I said, Blessed Konrad just happened to have the fortune or misfortune, whatever way you want to look at it, of being, one of the first during the first occupation that were killed in a swift way without the, as we know, the Bishop Slipy, who later was released and who became the patriarch, not the patriarch, but the leader of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, spent 23 years in Siberia in hard labor and so forth. And a lot of these stories are in the handouts that I gave you. All right, I'm going to just go to one other thing. Now, how is it, who did these persecutions, and how is it that you can get people to do what they did? I mean, these guys who actually shot my grandfather, the occupying soldiers, who were working against the church, what were they, were they acting under duress? Did they themselves have their lives at stake, or did they believe what they were doing? And, it turns out that all those years in Eastern Ukraine and Soviet Union, they were brought up on all this propaganda about how bad the Catholic Church is, how bad the whole Western country is, Western situation is, and so forth. So by the time they invaded Western Ukraine, they thought that they were doing people a favor by liberating them from the Catholic Church. And it's exemplified by one of the stories about one of the nuns that was martyred. And this was done not by the KGB, who knew exactly who they were looking for. the nun was shot by a regular soldier. And just to give you an example, they came to this convent and they knocked on the door. And the door opened and there was the nun answering the door. And there were a couple soldiers, Russian soldiers, and the one looked at her, pulled out his gun and shot her right in the head. The other soldiers turned to him and said, "What did you do? You didn't have to shoot her, you know?" They weren't there for that purpose. He said, "She's a nun in habit. They're evil people. They're bad people. I did the right thing." So this is how they were brought up, this invasion. So just to get an inkling of what years of propaganda and years of this kind of disinformation can do to people. And, you know, what is the heroic virtue in terms of a situation like that? Now, this fellow Dodds described, he says, every saint has to have heroic virtue. He has a tremendously interesting way of writing, and he said, saints still fall into two general categories, martyrs and non-martyrs. To become a canonized non-martyr, one has to have demonstrated heroic virtue. And of course, even the martyr has to have demonstrated heroic virtue, which was, we talked to, I always use the word prosecutor, but it's the promulgator, I can't think of the right name, the priest who promotes the cause. And you know, they had to investigate. They had so much hard time investigating a lot of these cases because the records were gone and papers were gone and so forth. And when finally they got to the KGB files, you know, the KGB files were very helpful because they were very exact. You know? But he said they had to demonstrate the heroic virtue. They couldn't just, because these people were martyred, that was not enough. They had to demonstrate heroic virtue. And heroic, what does it mean? It means a definition that's not too technical. It means a lot of virtue. And of course, what are the virtues? And of course, there's the basic virtues that called the supernatural virtues, because they can only be given by the Lord. That's, you know, faith. I have to read this right. Faith. These are called faith, hope, and love. These are the theological virtues. And prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude are known as the cardinal or moral virtues. And let's concentrate on the virtue of fortitude. And the virtue of fortitude for these particular martyrs was, you know, now we are living in a society which everything we're doing is correct and it's holy and it's good and we're helping people, you know, get to heaven. And all of a sudden, overnight, that turns out to be evil. That turns out to be not so good. And now how do we react to this? Do we compromise? Do we run? The answer was we continue to do what we were doing. And we continue to stick to the truth. And that's essentially a heroic virtue that is getting him canonized in the process, to summarize it in those particular time. And I wanted to connect that to why that's in modern times. Now, you know, we're facing a very similar time in society, different ways, not as violent, not as quick, although who knows, you know, what could happen politically. Nobody expected these events to happen. But we're finding that the propaganda war is on. If you read, I think you'll get in the message, I'll just do this very quickly. The latest issue of the Catholic World Report says Christians as Taliban and liberals cast the religious right as enemies of America. How will Democrats in the United States campaign against the president whose approval ratings are in the upper 80s? The answer, steal the war issue from the Republicans by scapegoating the religious right, presenting conservative Christians as the moral equivalent of the Taliban. In Newsweek article, this is a recent Newsweek article, New Year's issue, Howard Feynman reports that Democrats are planning a daring assault on the most critical turf in politics, the cultural mainstream. The GOP is out of the mainstream, some Democrats will argue next year, because it's too dependent upon an intolerant religious right. As Marvin Olasky notes, Democrats will use expressions like reproductive intolerance, you know, whole issue of abortion, contraception, etc., to attack pro-life Christians. This is an incendiary battle plan, essentially combating the GOP right, comparing the GOP right with the Taliban. Now, you wish the GOP was as a religious right as they're going to say they are, because they're not. But the point is that this thinking, and I'm going to skip a number thing, is some people are going to buy this thinking, just like these soldiers who shot the nun and these agents thought they were doing a good thing by eliminating priests, had been subject to years of propaganda about how evil the church was. You know, and people begin to buy this thinking because you have this language, this corruption of language. You know, if you're opposed to abortion, you're opposed to women's rights. Now, you got to be evil to be opposed to women's rights. If you're opposed to euthanasia, you're opposed to death with dignity. So you got to be evil to be opposed to death with dignity. Sexual immorality is, if you're opposed to sexual immorality, you're opposed to freedom of expression, and so forth and so forth. And this goes on. And I just said very recently, there are more terminology in the stem cell, where the truth is redefined in the stem cell situation. Well, how can you be opposed to killing these little embryos and getting their stem cell when this is a way of preventing disease? Well, it doesn't prevent any disease in the individual that's killed, but you ignore that and you say, well, maybe it'll help somebody else. So if you're opposed to that, you're against medicine. And very interesting little article on the woman who had Alzheimer's, has a form of Alzheimer's that occurs early in life, and she wanted to have children, but it's a hereditary condition, and she wanted to have a child that wouldn't have the same thing. So, through the process of in vitro fertilization, they fertilize 10, 15, 20 eggs, however many they can produce at one time, and then all these little embryos are created. And then there's a process of examining the embryos and finding which ones don't have the disease. So when they found the one that didn't have the disease, that's the one they used to implant, and she gave birth to a baby. And of course, what happened to all the other 20 others? They were all killed. So you now have 21 children conceived, 20 of them are dead, and one survives. Well, if you read the article in the medical journal, it said this was one way of preventing the disease. This was a preventive measure. Now, I propose to you, I can prevent all diseases in that way if we accept the premise, you see. But you see, this is how truth, simple scientific truth. Now, if you defend it and you say, hey, these are little embryos, human beings that you killed, they'll say, that's a religious concept. You can't impose your religion, so you have to keep that private. So this is the stage we're at now. So whenever you defend the unborn, you're religiously intolerant. And now, we've seen how religion can be used for some pretty bad things by the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda and so forth. And now you're going to have this equating, which this is not my idea, this is Newsweek is writing. There's going to equate any kind of strong religious view as the Taliban-like imposition of terrorism. We already have a case of a doctor in Canada who is his license is being taken away because he is refusing to write birth control pills, abortifacient birth control pills, which he knows kill embryos. So he's going to have his license taken away in Canada. We're going to get to that here. Now we have this push for that every insurance and every institution will have to cover abortifacient contraceptives in their prescription plans. Given this tragedy that has occurred and the state of alert, we now have a model legislation which is being passed in various states, which gives the sort of Emergency Health Powers Act, which essentially it's meant to, if you have biological warfare, if you have anthrax, that kind of thing, that the state can take over, and it can force doctors to do whatever, even if they consider something, unethical, that they have to be subject to whatever they're being told from above. Okay? You can see where there was some conditions where it requires some kind of action, but then you have an action which can have a completely negative effect given the wrong people come to power. And this is what happened in this situation, let's say in Ukraine. There was the biggest propaganda line in the first occupation was that the Catholic Church was connected with the Polish and the Western, and that they were agents of the Polish. Well, as I told you, it was a Polish bishop who didn't want Szeptycki canonized, beatified, because he stood for the rights of not only the Catholic Church, but the Orthodox Church, because they were treating the Orthodox Church worse, because at least the Catholic Church, they were all Catholics. So he stood up for the rights of the Catholic Church. He stood up for the rights of Jews during the German occupation. There's a fellow by the name of Kurt Lewin who wrote a book called My Journey Through Illusions, a wonderful book. There's a reference in your handouts. And the only reason he's alive was because Metropolitan Szeptycki's brother, made him a seminarian, a Catholic seminarian, sent him to a little seminary somewhere in the mountains, and he and his brother survived the war, and he later went on to Israel. Now he's a big businessman in Germany and Japan, very interesting. Both the countries that lost the war. And he testified at the beatification process of Andrew Szeptycki, and how his life was saved. Father Koch, was put in a concentration camp as a result of helping Jews, and so forth. And yet, the propaganda after the war was that the Catholic Church were collaborators with the Nazis, and people were made to believe that. And I have a little interesting. I love this lectern. It's beautiful. I have this little excerpt from 1976, somewhere here. And for all the years my father, whose name they had on their list as an escaped enemy of the state, received propaganda literature from the Soviet Union. This is a copy of it. But we received these little booklets and these little propaganda sheets where they had these beautiful Ukrainian girls dressed in national costume and all the flowers and everything else. And they named people here in the US who were the collaborators with the German. And they were usually, people who escaped for religious reasons like my father and so forth. And they were all wiped. And here in 1976, they give a little history about the standards, something about reaction to fascism and Nazism. 1976, and they mention my grandfather's name. How many years after his death? That he was a collaborator with the Nazis. The Nazis hadn't even arrived when he was killed. And our family there tells us that in the first years, they tried to, because everybody was so upset about his death, they said, oh, he was just killed because, it was crossfire during the war. Well, everybody witnessed it, they didn't believe that. Then they said, well, he was killed because he was, a collaborator with the Nazis. Well, Nazis hadn't come. Well, they had this whole theory that the Nazis were supporting the freedom fighters, Ukrainian freedom fighters, who, of course, during that time were fighting against the Russian occupation, and also probably had their, I'm sure, in those woods and in those caves in that area near the town. And they charge in here that the Metropolitan Sheptytsky used my grandfather as the liaison to the, quote, the anti-communist fighting forces. And it's very possible that he was a chaplain. Those soldiers, needed a mass and needed a spy posse. He did that. KGB had very good records on people, but they color this as being a collaborator with the Germans because, of course, it was well known that the Germans did secretly support the Ukrainian effort against the Russians, which was for their own political benefit. So if you were a chaplain for the soldiers in that effort, then therefore you were a collaborator with the Germans. Well, the technique is, but I think you get my message, that this verbal engineering, this propaganda, this disinformation, distortion of the truth, eventually there are people who believe it. Now, to end on this, my father would say to me, all the other people they mention in this book, are currently alive. They mention the people who had immigrated to the US, to Canada, to Australia, and so forth, and how they were he's the only one who's dead. And how many years that they still mention his name? Now, the KGB doesn't do anything without a reason. This was not random. So that means, to my father, who was a brilliant historian, that his memory is very well venerated there. And they need to continue to knock his memory down and his person and so forth, which is exactly what was the case. Because I remember seeing one picture, and whether this was real or not, I don't know, but years ago, I was very little, where the place where my father was killed, there was, a cross was placed there, there's a little mound made, and it became a place of pilgrimage in the woods. And the people would come there and pray. And there was a picture of the tree next to it, and somebody had a crutch on the tree. Somebody claimed they were cured, and they left the crutch there. Now, whether that was real or not, it's hard to prove. But at one point, the communists came and barbed wired the whole place off and said, this is off limits, no one can come here. Now, it's not his grave at the church, this is the place where he was killed in the woods. So clearly there was a cult, or whatever you want to call it, that's what they called it, a cult of people, remembering coming to pray at his grave. So, this goes on, and there were many events about miracles being performed, healings and so forth. And, I believe today, since the beatification, the efforts made that there are miracles. I'm studying the, other saints. They need one miracle for canonization, but hundreds of miracles happen. I know one patient of mine said has a brother who was actually cured during the canonization process for St. John Newman. And his case went to the diocese. He was a little boy then, and the case went to the diocese, and then they had another case, which was easier to prove, so they dropped his. But that doesn't mean that only one miracle happens. Many, many miracles happen. So I think we all, these are times of rebirth. The church in Ukraine, as a result of the blood of these martyrs, is now growing. They have 16 new parishes since 1991, 16 new parishes in Lviv. In the rest of eastern Ukraine and Russia now, Catholic churches are being opened, bishops are being assigned. Tremendous rebirth, and that is the effect. This is the way the Lord turns something evil into something good. So I think, as John mentioned before, we all have, I found out since we've been promoting his cause, everybody in their family has a need of a miracle. I don't care whether it's disease or other things, or people haven't left the church and so forth. Everywhere I talk, people say, well, would you pray to your grandfather for this and for this and for me? And I now have, before the beatification, when he's a servant of God, he can be venerated in the diocese where they're proposing him, but not anywhere else in the world, or privately. Now that he's beatified, he can be venerated anywhere. So I say, well, look, here's the prayer card. You pray yourself, Okay. Well, anyhow, so.
You're so lazy.
So what I want you to do, so we're going to end this on this note. And what I'll do is after we end, I'll tell you a little bit, those who want to stay, because it's late and I apologize for taking so long, about the cassock and the relics and so forth. But if we take out that card, I left one on that. And I know some people here are not Catholic, and it's always been, one of the criticisms is, how do you pray to saints? You shouldn't be praying to saints. You have Jesus Christ, and of course, he's the Lord, and God is the Father, and sacrilegious to pray to saints. Well, we don't pray to saints or the blessed. We, ask them for their intercession that they pray to Jesus and God the Father to achieve the favors or the miracles for us. But, the first thing I realized when this prayer, which was put together by, or at least given the imprimatur by Cardinal Ljubomir Huzar, is a prayer to God that says, we now know that you have accepted Blessed Nicholas Konrad as a saint in heaven. The Pope has declared that. We know that now. That is a fact. So now let's get him more venerated on earth, give him more credits on earth by allowing these miracles to happen to attribute to him. So this is a tribute to him. We're praying to God to get miracles. So you see, for all that criticism about why we pray to the saints. So it goes both ways. We ask the saint to pray for us to God, and we ask God to venerate the saint by allowing a miracle to occur so that his people, the saints, who are our example for us to emulate, can then be proclaimed more and more on earth here. So we'll end this with this prayer. We can say it all together on the back of the card. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. From the depths of our souls, O God, we worship your infinite majesty. We thank you for the graces and gifts which you have given your faithful servant, Father Nicholas Konrad. We ask that he also be venerated on earth. We beseech you in your fatherly mercy, grant me the favor which I now humbly ask of you. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you very much.
We thank Dr. Isajiw very much. It's a wonderful inspiration to hearing these stories. And encourage friends and relatives to come with you to hear the remaining stories of Saints for Our Time, because it does provide us with great hope and strengthens us as well. I guess George has concluded it, I feel free to leave, but I'm not going to because I have more about that. So thank you very much for being with us, and hope to see you again in the future. Please, George.
Okay, so for those who wish to stay and look, this cassock doesn't look much like a cassock. Well, it used to be a cassock. This was actually what he was wearing, plus the vestments over top of it when he was taken away. But in 1945, my grandmother and, of course, other members of our family were refugees, and they got as far as Vienna. Very poor. They were still under Russian occupation in Vienna. There was nothing to eat. There were no clothes. So my grandmother decided to make this into a dress for herself. which is what you see now. And she was a great seamstress. Even though she came from a very educated family, she was herself had degrees and was educated. But every woman in those days, because you couldn't just go to Woolworths and buy stuff, it was, prided in sewing her own clothes. So she was very good at it. And if you look at this and say later on, I'll leave it out. You can come out and look at it closely. And as I do this, just want to say I was reading in Mr. Dodd's book about the meaning of relics. And there's first-degree relics, second-degree relics, and third-degree relics. And of course, some people have called me a third-degree relic. And in a way, it makes sense, because a first-degree is actually a piece of the body, skin or hair or something, or wait a minute, I want to make sure I get this right. I always get this wrong. One thing when you do these things, you can't spread heresy or anything that's not true. Okay, so you have a first-class relic. It's a part of the saint's body. That's perfectly that. So now, of course, blood is part of a saint's body. We do have the pillow on which he was laid out during his funeral, which was saturated with that fresh blood that never decomposed. That's in view at the office that promotes the causes of these saints. We donated that. The second-class relic is an item that was worn or used by a saint during his or her lifetime. So this is a second-degree relic. However, as you will see, I'll tell you in a minute, there is some portion of that is first-degree. And third-degree relic is an item that has been touched to a first-class relic. So I guess that's how I qualified to be a third. Okay. Anyhow, you get the message. Well, this is both the first and second degree, because the second degree is obvious. He wore this, before she made it into a dress. But when he was shot, there's a bullet hole here, and it was covered up neatly. As a matter of fact, there's two bullet holes, the entrance and the exit, and it was covered up by my grandmother with a patch. And if you look under the patch, you will see the bullet hole. But more important than that, you had these seams. Some of them were redone. Of course, it's been washed a million times, but it was pretty bloody, I'm sure, at the time. Now, when you wash bloody material in hot water, the blood decomposes, the hemoglobin gives up its iron, the protein washes away, but the iron stains the thread and actually becomes part of the thread. And you can never wash that away. That's why we always say, if you cut yourself, don't wash that in hot water or you'll never be able to get it off your clothes. So you wash it in cold water, that just washes it off. Well, I guess they didn't know that. They washed it in hot water, or at least these seams, and you will see what looks like rust when you look at some of these seams. And this is the actual staining of the iron that came from his blood. So the iron was in his blood, that's part of his body, so that part is the first-degree relic. I guess. That's my scientific or non-scientific. So anyhow, again, relics are not, in themselves objects of veneration, but they are to remind us of the saint, and again, to put us in a frame of mind. So, some people, we look at these relics, and they have actually pieces of bodies of the saints of old, but these pieces were obtained years later. It wasn't at the time that they died, because at the time they died, nobody knew they were going to be a saint. So they were done much, much later. So anyhow.